Raoul, 1897. I had no trouble when I came back to Bookbox 5 for this evening's performance. No one looked up in horror, one hand to his mouth. No one rushed off to consult an anxious management over my heinous request. In the 17 intervening years since I last attended this theater, staff have died, moved on, and been replaced. No one remembers the opera ghost now, except as a vague legend, and I dare say that no one remembers me either. I'm 38 this year, but if I'm honest with myself, I have to admit that I look at least 10 years older. Grief and bitterness have aged me to a point where no one in Paris would now recognize me as the Vicomte de Chagny. Not that I mind that. I haven't come here tonight to be recognized. I've come to remember and to pay tribute to my memories. Drawing my watch from my pocket, I frown as the minutes tick away inexorably to curtain time. Looks as if Charles isn't going to make it in time for the overture. Damnable ill luck. Our carriage running over that stray dog. Of course, Charles was out of the door like a shot, picking the poor creature out of the gutter, never minding that his dress suit was covered in mud and blood, insisting we find a veterinary surgeon immediately. No mean feat on a Friday night in Paris. Look, Dad. You go on to the restaurant without me. I'll sort this out and meet you at the opera later. Charles, I'm not very happy about this. Your mother would never have forgiven me if she thought I'd left you running around Paris alone in the dark. That smile. That irresistibly sunny smile with which he's always resisted my tiresome authority. The smile which makes it quite impossible to protest against his quiet determination. Dad, I'm 16, and I speak French as well as you do. I promised Mother I'd looked after you. Make sure you ate. Now, go and have your dinner, like a good fellow. I'll meet you later. It's quite impossible to argue with Charles when he's made up his mind. Ever since Christine died, he's been organizing me, providing a non-stop whirlwind of activity to stop me brooding. And I haven't had the strength or the heart to resist his well-meant efforts. It was his idea to come back to France on this visit, to make this pilgrimage to the opera and see the famous Horseshoe Auditorium, which Christine knew her great triumph. But it was my idea to book Box 5. And even now, I'm not entirely sure what streak of perversity has brought me back to a place that was once Erik's private domain. There's nothing to distinguish this box from any other on the Grand Tier. Same carpet, same armchairs, same red hangings, and red velvet ledge. And yet, I'd like to fancy it has a unique atmosphere, an aura of repressed memories. I'd like to fancy that if I spoke, he would hear me. Odd, really. Since Christine died, I often felt a great need to speak to Erik. It's as though I've come to believe that he has the right to know, to see at last how it all ended. A hand on my shoulder. Hello, Dad. Just made it in time after all. I turned to look up, at my heart is squeezed at the sight of this lovely boy who bears no resemblance to me or Christine. If I ever doubted my own fears, if I ever tried to persuade myself that I was mistaken, I can't do it tonight. Can't fool myself any longer. With every year that passes, his features conform more closely to that portrait which I keep safely locked in a private drawer. Even Christine never knew it lay in my possession. I never confronted her with it. We kept our secrets from each other to the very end. Charles slides into the chair beside me with the unhurried grace that sets him entirely apart from other boys of his age, and turns to give me a smile of encouragement. I know this won't be easy for you, Dad, but afterward, you'll be glad you came and laid the ghost to rest. My God, sometimes I swear this boy has psychic powers. He has such an uncanny knack of touching a raw nerve with healing fingers. But of course, he only thinks of Christine. can't possibly imagine the sheer magnitude of conflicting emotions that surged through my weary brain tonight. The lights dimmed slowly in the great auditorium, and Charles lifts his opera glasses from their case, leaning forward a little in his seat with taut anticipation. In a few minutes, he will be quite lost in the music, forgetting me, forgetting his dead mother, forgetting everything except his need to commune with a force that's always been beyond my understanding. Music is in his soul, extends to every fiber of his being, and already in England they are hailing him as the most outstanding young concert pianist to emerge this century. Women crowd to his recitals, embarrassing him afterwards with their fulsome praise and overt admiration of his good looks. As if it matters what I look like, he once burst out indignantly. It shouldn't come into it. Should it, Dad? Why can't they listen to the music instead of making cow's eyes over my face? Yes, Charles at 13 had considered an absolute imposition to look like a young god. You don't suppose they only come just to look at me, do you? He'd asked in horror. Strange how he always insisted on coming to me with all his anxieties. Always to me rather than Christine. Even when he was very young, and I did absolutely nothing to encourage his confidence. Or thought I didn't. Some sort of poetic justice, I suppose. Glancing at him now, seeing him safely absorbed in the music, I laid my own opera glasses quietly aside and sank back in my armchair with my eyes closed. I have no real interest in Carmen, you see. Against the darkness of my lids, I have already begun to relive a more personal opera, the one in which I once quite unwittingly found myself playing a leading role. 17 years ago, in the uncharted bowels of this very theater. The heat in the mirrored chamber had very quickly reached an almost unendurable level, causing me to fling off my jacket and rip open the neck of my dress shirt, and I listened in helpless anguish to the conversation in the adjoining room. Sweat was rolling off me in torrents within minutes, soaking the stiff white linen and blinding me with a steady tickle of salty droplets. I hammered on the thick glass in impotent rage, but it resisted the onslaught of my bare fists, and at length I fell back defeated, cursing savagely and gasping for breath. The air seemed to have become very thin and rarefied. I could not suck sufficient quantity into my laboring lungs, and already I was beginning to grow dizzy and disoriented. Slumping down on the floor, where it felt a little cooler, I struggled to concentrate on the terrible scene which was escalating beyond the walls of my prison. Erik spoke at first with an icy, controlled sarcasm, but as I listened intently, I detected increasing signs of insanity in his words, and realized with horror that the man was now quite out of his mind. Panic seized me when I heard Christine begin to plead with him, and that warning note of impending violence suddenly entered his voice. Dear God, she was making him angry. Terribly angry. Couldn't she see that every word she spoke only increased his rage and bitterness? Be quiet, I wailed her silently. Don't say any more, or he'll kill you. I heard him shouting at her, the sound of some object being hurled across the room. I heard her ask him what he wanted. And after that I heard no more. There was a long, untellable silence which seemed to stretch on and on into infinity, and the hollow trembling that came over me sapped the last of my strength and hope. I assumed that the inevitable had happened, that he had strangled her, and if she was dead, I no longer unduly cared what became of me. When the mirror in the front of me opened of itself, I didn't move for a moment. And then, with a curious, unhurried calm, I paused to pick up my jacket, delaying the awful moment when I would be forced to look upon what he had done. I would not have believed it possible to pass into such a state of utter apathy. I felt tired and very, very old as I staggered into the room beyond. My brain appeared to have ceased functioning entirely, even when I saw them both standing there. I could not at first assimilate the fact that Christine was still alive. They were standing very close, almost close enough to touch, and Christine was staring up at him with an intensity that entirely excluded me and everything else in the room. She seemed aware of nothing but him. I would have said she was in a state of trance, save for the look in her eyes, that astonishing look which seemed to not be one of fear, but rather one of revelation. It was he who moved first, turned around, and so afforded me a first glimpse of his horrific face. God, she hadn't lied, had she? How was it possible for anything living to look like that? He walked away from her and approached me slowly with a heavy sigh. Put on your jacket, young man, or you will take your chill, he said with quiet severity. Incredulously, never taking my eyes off of him for a second, I struggled into my tailcoat with difficulty. Let me see you walk in a straight line. I beg your pardon? I stammered uncertainly. Again he sighed with a kind of weary patience, as though I were some particularly dull-witted child committed to his unwilling care. It will be necessary for you to row some distance in the dark. I have no intention of allowing you to take her in that boat until I am assured of your strength and sense of balance. Now, let me see you walk. I crossed the chamber and returned in accordance with his gesture. Christine had not moved. She appeared to be frozen to the spot, and still she gazed at him transfixedly. But for the moment, amazement washed all thought of her strange behavior from my mind. He's going to let us go? I really believe he means to let us go. You appear to have taken little harm, continued Erik gravely. I advise small quantities of fluid at regular intervals during the next 12 hours. Please remember that excessive water will make you ill, as will alcohol. I stared at him with very disbelief. This man who had tried to kill me was now speaking to me as though he were my father, or my doctor. Perhaps I was hallucinating after all. I would like you to marry her as soon as possible, he said slowly. I assume you will be perfectly agreeable to that. I nodded at him, utterly stupefied at his turn of the conversation. Good. Now, I'm going to ask you a very impertinent question, and I would appreciate a very honest answer in return. Will you have sufficient income to keep her if your family should cut you off? Now don't be stiff-necked and proud, boy. You're only 20, and you've not entered your majority yet, and I would prefer to give you whatever you need rather than see my child marry a pauperized aristocrat. I assured him my finances were in entirely satisfactory condition, convinced now that I was merely taking part in some bizarre dream. Any minute now, I was going to wake up limp with relief and swear never to take cheese for supper again. He returned to Christine and made a curt gesture for me to accompany him. From the corner of my eye, I became aware of the Persian standing in the doorway of the torture chamber, watching us without comment. Erik took hold of Christine's hand, looking down for a moment at her small fingers entwined in his long skeletal bones. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but he placed a finger on her lips to silence her. Hush, my dear. There's nothing more to say now. It has all been arranged. I won't be able to give you away in the church, of course, so I'd like to do it now. As he joined her hand with mine, I became uncomfortably aware that tears were coursing unheeded down his sunken cheeks. I never go to weddings, you see, he murmured dimly. People keep asking me, but I always say no. Weddings make me cry. It's better not to go. I like to keep the invitations. though. I have a whole drawer full of invitations. Weddings, christenings, funerals. A whole drawer full. Can you believe that, young man? I nodded hastily. I would have agreed with him that black was white that night if he required it of me. Anything. Anything that would permit me to get her to safety away from this temple of doom. He fell silent for a moment, wiping away the tears from which we were falling steadily onto our joined hands. No longer his alone, I noted, for Christine, too, was now weeping silently. I know it's not good manners to ask, but really, I should like to have your invitation very badly. For my collection, you know. Handwritten and hand-delivered. One can't trust the post. You see, not down here. So will you do that for me, young man? Will you swear to bring her back the day before the wedding and deliver that invitation to me? I promise that I shan't keep you long, but I believe on such a day it would be quite permissible to kiss the bride, would it not? Yes, I said faintly. The man was mad and dangerous and must be humored, yet it was not easy to remain unmoved in the face of such a barely controlled grief. Yes, I will bring her back. The day before. Whatever you wish, sir. I think he smiled. It was difficult to be sure with such severely deformed lips. You will find the lantern in the boat, he continued quietly. Christine knows the way to the other side. He stood back and gestured for me to take her. Christine made a movement toward him, but I caught her arm and held her in a furious grip as Erik turned her back on us and began to walk unsteadily toward the Persian. My dear friend, he said with a sudden unmistakable affection that astonished me, I very much hope, you'll do me the honor of making tea in the drawing room before you leave. The Persian's reply was too soft for me to hear, but appeared to be assent, for after a moment the two men went through into another room together and shut the door. Christine stared at the closed door with disbelief, but this time, when I tugged at her arm, she came with me without any further resistance. I tried not to notice she was still crying. For the next few weeks, I was very busy, chasing around Paris, making arrangements for a hasty marriage and a passage to England with as much secrecy as I could contrive. I knew it would be quite impossible for us to remain in France. My marriage would be considered a terrible mésalliance, frowned upon by friends and family alike, and, with so many doors shut against us, it would be infinitely preferable to go where we had not been known. Besides, I could not get out of my mind the idea that it would be as well as to put much distance as possible between Christine and the opera house. And to me, the English Channel seemed the ultimate barrier. She expressed no comment when I suggested that we should go to England for a while. She showed me neither pleasure nor interest in my arrangements. I tried to be patient. She had been through a terrible ordeal, and she was still in a state of shock. I could hardly expect her to say, "Thank God it's all over," and behave as though nothing had happened. But as the days passed, she appeared to grow more agitated and distressed. The shadows under her eyes became so dark that they assumed the appearance of black bruises, and she took to wearing a hat with a little veil whenever we went out, which admittedly wasn't often. Left to herself, she was inclined to huddle in front of the fire, staring at the flickering coals and moving the beads of her rosary relentlessly through her fingers. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women. It seemed to be as far as she could ever get. Her maid told me she repeated those lines over and over again, and hearing that, a little snake of fear began to twist and writhe at the back of my mind. The day before the wedding, I arrived with an armful of flowers to find her waiting for me, with a little gilt-edged card in one hand. On the table stood a huge brass key and a small, curiously shaped metal object which I could not place. "It's time for us to go back," she said. I looked at the invitation neatly written in her beautiful copperplate hand, and something inside me snapped. In that moment, I ceased to be the high-born hero of our little melodrama, the perfect gentleman and the adoring lover, all those things which made me into a weak, gullible young man, hopelessly manipulated by infatuation, giving way to the anger and fear that had been festering inside me for many weeks. I caught her by the shoulders and shook her savagely. "If you think for one moment that I will take you back there, you must be out of your mind."
"But you promised," she gasped. "You promised him."
"Of course I promised. I'd have promised to cut off my leg to get you out of his hands. The man is insane. Christine, utterly deranged. You must be quite mad yourself to think I ever intended to keep that promise." She swayed back from me and sank into the chair beside the fire.
"If you won't take me," she said unsteadily, "I shall go by myself."
Leaning forward, I snatched the invitation from her trembling hand and tore it into a half-dozen pieces. "If you go back to him, you won't be needing to take this with you," I said furiously. "If you go back now, there won't be any wedding. Do you understand what I'm saying, Christine?" She nodded dumbly, staring down at the scraps of white card which had scattered into the tiled grate. Without another word, I slammed out of the building and got into the carriage that waited outside. I waited 5 minutes, hoping desperately that she would run after me and beg me to stay. But she did not come out, and when I looked up, I could see no sign of her at the window. Reaching home, I shocked my valet by demanding a decanter of brandy in my room. And once immured there in privacy, I proceeded to get very quickly and ingloriously drunk. I wasn't accustomed to hard drinking of spirits. I suppose in many ways I was still remarkably naive and innocent. 20 years old and still a virgin. But I'd never wanted anyone except Christine, and I couldn't believe that I would ever want anyone else. At some point during the evening, I have a vague memory of smashing my glass in the hearth in an excess of outraged self-pity. But the following morning, waking with a pounding headache and weary resignation, I knew I had to take her back. I would take her back this one last time, and then perhaps it would truly be over, and we could begin to live our own life together. When I arrived at her apartment, the half-witted girl of hers informed me that Mademoiselle had gone out the previous evening and not yet returned. No message had been left for me. "Monsieur," said the little maid timidly, "I am very much afraid for Mademoiselle. She is not herself these days." "I know," I said absently, turning away with my hat in hand. I must have been crazy to leave her alone in that state. "Do you perhaps know where she could have gone, monsieur?" I stared at the pedestrians milling carelessly along the streets, the sight of Paris going cheerful and unconcerned about its business. "Yes," I said with grim resignation. "I know where she is." "A sledgehammer?" gasped my driver in astonishment. "Monsieur, forgive me. Did you say a sledgehammer?" "I did." Sitting back in my carriage, I glared at the man, and with evident good sense he decided not to pursue the issue any further. It took him almost 2 hours, but at length he presented me with my odd request and deposited me, in accordance with my instructions, outside the opera. I told him to wait till I returned. He had been with my family for many, many years, and I trusted both his loyalty and his discretion. It was shortly after midday, and the Grand Escalier was deserted. But I was a very well-known patron that no one would have thought of questioning my presence on the premises, even if they had seen me. I carried my coat over my arm, and the sledgehammer was carefully hidden beneath. I knew only one means of entry to Erik's house, and made my way unerringly along the route that the Persian had shown me, to the stone in the third serra. Knowing that I would find myself once more in the torture chamber, I came armed to smash my way through the toughened glass structure, only to find that my precaution had been quite unnecessary, The mirror room was in darkness. The door stood open, and I walked into the chamber beyond the slightest inconvenience. I was appalled by the scene of devastation which met my eyes. The room had been wrecked, almost beyond all recognition, the black tapestries torn down and cut to shreds, the magnificent pipe organ ripped from the wall and smashed to pieces, the dark red carpet littered with shed sheets of a musical score. All he valued, everything he must have held dear in those years of solitude, had been mutilated and destroyed in some insane ritual of grief. Staring at the sad remnants of his blighted existence, I knew a moment of shocked pity. My foot crunched upon the glass, and bending down, I picked up a double picture frame. On one side was a faded line portrait of an astonishingly good-looking man. The other, covered by a fractured pane of glass, I could not see clearly. A movement in a room beyond made me stuff the picture frame automatically into my pocket, before turning to meet the inevitable challenge. Expecting Erik, I found myself facing the Persian. "Good morning, Monsieur de Chagny," he said calmly, in his heavily accented French. "Or perhaps, since I perceive it is now past midday, it would be more correct to say good afternoon." Returning his chained watch to his breast pocket, he glanced around with a look of quiet despair and finally indicated a black leather couch which appeared to have survived the destruction largely intact. "Perhaps you would care to be seated," he continued with great civility. I didn't move. "Where are they?" I demanded. "Where has he taken her?" Silently, the Persian waved one hand in the direction of a closed door that I had not noticed before. "In there?" As I made a movement to step past him, his hand fell heavily on my arm with all the authority of a policeman's. "Stay here, monsieur. You have no place in that room now." I glared at him. "I have every right." "You have no rights in this matter," he said steadily. "I have no desire to resort to physical force, but if I must, I will. You should not enter that room while I'm here to prevent it." Tense silence descended between us as we stared at each other. Reluctant enemies suddenly, where bare weeks ago we had been ill-assorted allies. The dark olive skin was puckered and swollen around the tired eyes, the mouth drawn and thin as though it had been dragged down at the corners by the weight of untold grief. This stern, upright, elderly Oriental, who had once dragged me with him underground with desperate urgency and barely concealed anger, appeared to have been weeping steadily for many hours. He looked like a broken old man who could bear no more. I could easily have overpowered him, with one hand tied behind my back, and yet I found I had no heart to do it. I wanted to cling to the strength and support that anger afforded me, but I found my anger was already deserting me, dwindling rapidly away, leaving nothing behind in its place except emptiness and fear. I went and sat on the couch, as I had been bidden, gazing dully at the twisted pipes of the organ and the broken black candles strewn among the upturned pewter candelabra. "Erik did this?" The Persian nodded gravely. "Why?" "He did not expect you to return. He said that he considered you to be a sensible young man, and that quite understandably you would forbid it. In your place, he said, you would have done exactly the same. You wished no trace of his presence to be left on this earth after his death. The chamber beyond, which contains Mademoiselle Dayer's possessions, was the only room he could not bring himself to destroy. After his last seizure, he permitted me to take him there and lay him upon the bed, saying it was only fitting that he would die in the place where he had been born. He would not allow me to remove the mask." I looked up. "Is he really dying?" "I cannot think that mercy will be long denied to him now." "You think he deserves mercy?" I demanded coldly. "I do not defend what he has done." "But you forgive him, don't you?" "Yes," said the person softly, turning away to pick up a torn sheet of manuscript. "I forgive him." We were silent for a while. The Persian gathered up several scraps of manuscript and attempted to piece them together before abandoning the futile effort with a wary shake of his head. 20 years he worked upon this piece, monsieur. I begged him to let me take it away with me, but he said he did not wish it to ever be played in public. It is a tragedy. So much genius simply to be wiped from the face of the earth without trace. How long has she been with him? Since you arrived last night. She asked that I would leave them alone together. Naturally, I have respected her wish. He turned away so hastily that I knew at once he was hiding something. Tell me what you saw before you left them. Monsieur, tell me. The Persian stared at the floor as though he could no longer bring himself to look into my eyes. She removed the mask and gave it to me, asking me to stand as her witness before God. He stopped for a moment as though begging silently to be released from this confession, but I merely waited stonily for him to continue. She kissed his forehead many times, moving slowly and carefully as though she feared to leave some small crevice of skin untouched by her mouth. She kissed each closed lid and followed the tracks of his tears with her lips. The Persian broke off abruptly, and this time he did not continue. Nor did I ask him to. The silence in the room grew oppressive, seemed to have consumed the very air between us. What am I to do? I asked at last. What am I to do now? The Persian sighed heavily. Do what Erik trusted you to do. My friend, take the child and cherish her until death parts you. His greatest fear was that she should be left alone in the world. That was why he sent her away with you, even though he knew she was already to stay at last. Monsieur, if your love for her is truly as great as his, it will survive this revelation unchanged. I sat very still beneath the Persian's pitying gaze, listening to the huge clock that seemed to be ticking steadily inside my head, ticking away the optimism of youth along with the last hour of Erik's life. I no longer felt young. Here in this house on the lake, I had surely aged 100 years. Erik had judged me strong enough to live the rest of my life with a ghost. Perhaps he had overestimated my courage. Time dragged in the artificial light, and when at last the connecting door clicked softly open and shut some hours later, I hardly dared to raise my head. It was the Persian who got up and guided Christine to my side. Her eyes, which had been so full of torment these last few weeks, were now serene, almost otherworldly. In their newfound peace, a strange, pale-colored cat rested in the crook of her arm, and she recessed its smooth fur with my absent hand. Feeling lost and totally inadequate, I stood up and placed an arm uncertainly around her shoulders. The cat stirred and hissed at me with brief hostility, but Christine did not seem to notice. I looked at the Persian, suddenly desperate for guidance, but he merely shook his head slightly and pressed my hand with renewed sympathy and friendship. Take her home, he sighed quietly. I will deal with all that remains to be done here. And so, for the last time, I rode across the leaden waters in that cold subterranean vault. The cat came with us, but I did not question its presence. I knew I had forfeited the right to ask questions. We had no light except for the dim flicker of a single lantern in the prow, so I cannot be sure, not entirely sure, that my senses did not deceive me. But her hand moved to soothe the agitated animal. I caught no flash of diamonds in the thin gold band which adorned her wedding finger. It was dark when we reached the streets outside. The day had died into an early dusk without our knowledge, and as we traveled to her apartment in my waiting carriage, her fingers remained hidden from view. At any time, I could have leaned over and snatched her hand from cover, but I did not do it. If the ring she wore that night was not mine, I did not want to know about it. We were not married for another month, at her instance. She told me that she wished me to have time to reflect, to consider whether I might not prefer to take my freedom instead. I want you to be sure, Raoul. Quite sure
that you can forgive me first, she said. And to this new Christine, so oddly calm and determined, suddenly quite frighteningly composed and grown up, I made no murmur of protest. 4 weeks later, we made our vows to each other in a private ceremony before a priest. There were no guests, only her maid and my driver present to stand as witness. The following day, we took the boat to England.
I grew to hate the cat.
I'm quite fond of animals as a rule, but I learned to hate that wretched animal as much as it quite obviously hated me. For a few weeks before we went to England, I was reasonably certain it was going to die. It cried inconsolably, cried pitiably, I suppose in a horrible unearthly wail that reminded me uncomfortably of a determined baby, or a demented baby. Refusing to eat, it walked endlessly around Christine's little flat, calling for its dead master. I suggested it would be kinder to have it put down, but the look of horror on Christine's face ensured I never made the mistake of mentioning that particular solution again. By the time we were due to sail, the creature appeared to have reconciled itself to Christine's care, and had taken to following her around with a desperation that I might have found sadly touching, under different circumstances. I found it rather hard to accept that the animal was really a cat. In looks and behavior, it reminded me more closely of a monkey, willful, destructive, and curiously possessive. It made no secret of its instinctive dislike for me. If I came too near, the fur along its spine rose ominously, the blue eyes narrowed to hostile slits, and the kinked whippy tail began to wave warningly from side to side. To this day, I'm unable to look upon a Siamese cat without a shudder of revulsion. We had been about 2 months in England when Christine told me we were to have a child, and I swung her up in my arms, ecstatic with relief to know that at last we were to have something. One small area of our life that he could not touch. I ordered champagne to celebrate the news, and when Christine and I touched our glasses together, I bent down to lay my hand upon the cat, which, as unusual, lay curled on her knee with peremptory air. The sense of warmth and well-being that was surging through me made me determined there and then to make peace with the creature. I had privately christened the little white rat. Want to be friends now? I offered in conciliatory tones, holding my hand palm down beneath the moist black nose to show that I intended no threat. The cat bit me. Sank its teeth straight into the bone, just as though it were a wretched dog. Oh, Raoul, Christine sighed. Why don't you just leave her alone? You know she doesn't like strangers. Blood was streaming down my finger, but I was too intrinsically happy that evening to brood on any hidden meaning that might have been attached to those words. I did not even pause to consider the implications of being called a stranger in my own house, by my own wife. Christine's pregnancy rapidly became the determining factor which governed my decision to remain in England. From the very beginning, there seemed to be one complication following hard on another, and toward the end of the confinement she began to suffer from fits and had to be continually sedated. For weeks on end, the house was swathed in silence. Christine was cared for in a darkened room by a nurse who wore quiet slippers, an unstarched apron. None of my staff were permitted to converse above whispers on the second floor. The cat howled unheard in the servants' kitchen, and it was more than anyone's place was worth it to let it escape upstairs. I had warned that any disturbance, noise, bright lights, or sudden movement could be sufficient to precipitate a fit. And the longer the fits endured, the greater the chance of heart and renal failure or cerebral hemorrhage. I sat for hours in that heavily curtained room, dreading the moment when the white face on the pillows would begin to jerk in uncontrolled spasms. She was so deeply drugged with chloral that most of the time she was quite insensible of my presence. I was crushed with guilt and found my thoughts turning voluntarily toward Erik. I knew that he would have killed me for harming his child, and whenever a breath of air stirred the dark drapes at the window during the evening, I felt a coldness at the nape of my neck and dared not look around. The doctor struggled for over a month to stabilize Christine's condition, But then there was a sudden, rapid deterioration which caused him to request an immediate interview in my study. He was a forthright, determined man who put matters very plainly. Christine's condition had become so serious that he considered the only means of saving her life would be through immediate surgery. Surgery! The word knocked at my heart like an echo of doom. Caesarean section, a very dangerous operation, Mr. Deschamps. I will not deceive you on that point. However, I think I might say without fear of correction that there is no more eminent surgeon in the whole of Europe than Professor Lister of King's. We're very fortunate to be in London at this time, sir. 5 years ago, Lister's teachings were still not widely accepted in this city. Even our best established surgical consultants continue to pour scorn on his antiseptic procedures. The doctor's voice buzzed meaninglessly in my ears. I could not concentrate on his discourse on sepsis. To the best of my knowledge, this particular operation was only ever performed as a last-ditch attempt to deliver a living child from a dying mother. I won't give my consent, I said dimly. I won't have her butchered for the sake of a child who cannot possibly survive 8 weeks before its time. The doctor glanced at me in surprise. The child will be roughly a month premature. Certainly no more than that, I can assure you. With care, it should have a reasonable chance of survival. But I have to tell you quite plainly, sir, that without this operation, both the mother and child would unquestionably die. The world seemed to have stopped turning slowly on its axis. The only sound in the room was the dull thudding of my heart. If this man was correct, and he could of course be mistaken, for no doctor is entirely infallible on such matters, and it could not possibly be my child that was slowly killing Christine. I want you to be sure first, Raoul. Quite sure that you forgive me. If I refused consent, they would both die. If I gave consent, Christine might still die. Of course. But the child could well live, a child who might not be mine. There was no question of choice now. How soon can you operate? I said with quiet despair. The reek of carbolic acids is indelibly associated in my memory with the birth of Charles. They brought him to me as soon as he was born, and as I looked down with relief on a small, thin, bluish face that was quite recognizably human, tears blurred my vision. He was so tiny and fragile with his little stick arms and legs. Surely the doctor had been mistaken after all. I was told it would be as well to have him baptized immediately, and since Christine was deeply unconscious, the final choice of name lay with me. I called him Charles. Seems like a very ordinary name. A week later, when we were reasonably certain that Christine too would live, Professor Lister advised me seriously to make sure there were no more children. It is, of course, entirely a matter of your own consequence, sir, but I would not be true to mine if I withheld my considered opinion. Your wife's case history, coupled with the possibility of a rupture of scar tissue and a subsequent confinement. He spread his strong hands expressively. I'm very sorry, Mr. Deschamps. This is not news I would not give lightly to a young husband, but at least you have your son. I stared out the window without replying, and at length, no doubt deciding that my hot French blood forbade common decency and consideration toward a wife. Lister frowned and left me to my own thoughts. I continued to stare out the window for a long time. There were ways, of course. There had been ways since time immemorial. Ways that were directly against the teaching of our church and by no means infallible. But there was only one way to be sure, and I did not need to ask what choice Erik would have made under such circumstances. I took a long lease on a house near the botanical gardens, hired one of those formidable creatures known as English nannies, and determined to be cheerful with my lot. On recovery, Christine was gentle and affectionate toward me, always ready to put aside whatever she was doing to devote herself to my interests. But there was distance in her manner, an intrinsic serenity that always seemed to exclude me from her inner thoughts. And somehow the harder she tried to make me happy, the more quietly certain I became that she had loved Erik far more than she ever loved me. We were not unhappy together, far from it, in spite of the difficult circumstances under which we were obliged to live. Indeed, among those friends we made in England, we were generally held to be a marvelous example, with our outwardly perfect marriage and our unquestionably perfect child. From an early age, it was evident that Charles would be exceptionally musical, and as soon as he began to tinker determinedly with the piano, I tried to exclude myself from his life, immuring myself in my study, or behind the safe wall of a newspaper. Whenever Nanny brought him downstairs for inspection, I suppose I might have succeeded, as so many English fathers seem to do, had it not been for Charles' equal determination not to be shut out. It was difficult to ignore a child who always welcomed my return with such delight, who consistently flung himself off the sixth stair in the blithe expectation of being caught in my arms, who brought me kites and toy soldiers to be mended, and later begged me to attend his recitals, because there will be so many ladies there. He always tiptoed rather cautiously around Christine's fierce devotion, as though her love were a delicate ornament that he feared to break, and he seemed to enter some unspoken conspiracy with me to spare her all the worry and pain. "Don't tell Mother, will you?" he whispered anxiously, as I held him over a sink 10 minutes before the first public recital. I promised not to tell, rubbed his white face with a rough towel until some vestige of color returned to his cheeks, and then suffered agonies for him as he walked through the silent, crowded room to seat himself at the awesomely lonely piano. He looked so very young and vulnerable, and when he caught my eye, I gave him a nod of encouragement that made him smile. Christine's hand was in mine throughout the first performance, and at the end, when the entire room got to its feet to applaud, I squeezed her fingers very hard while our eyes shared a knowledge that could never be voiced. Ironically, the very thing which should have driven us apart became the link that soldered us together. I thank God for Charles many times over, and not all my reasons for doing so were particularly noble. The cat, that damned cat, eventually deserted Christine and became positively devoted to him. It took to sleeping on his bed when he was about 2 years old, a practice I did absolutely nothing to discourage, in spite of Nanny's indignant protests about fleas. It's good for a child to have a pet," I said coolly. When called upon to give a ruling in the matter, Nanny subsided into furious silence, and no doubt said a lot of hard things about eccentric Frenchmen in the servants' hall later, but I didn't care unduly. As long as the animal resided in the nursery, it could not be with my wife, insinuating itself between us like some sort of wretched sentinel. Besides, it seemed oddly fitting that they should form a little menagerie up on the nursery floor. They belonged together, in a strange way, did they not? The cat and the cuckoo in one's nest. It lived to a rare old age, that cat, and finally died with its customary inconsiderate perversity, sometimes in the early morning of Charles' 12th birthday. "You bloody thing," I found myself thinking uncharitably. "He'd have been back at boarding school tomorrow. Couldn't you have waited till then?" I glanced at Charles, who was devastated, yet manfully trying to govern his tears in front of me. "I'll get a box," I said grimly. When I returned, I found that he had removed the animal's exotic collar. "I expect Mother would want to keep this, won't she?" "I dare say. Damn. I watched him wrap the stiff animal tenderly in its blanket and lay it reluctantly in the box. "It seems wrong somehow," he murmured softly. "Such a plain, rough box and no ceremony." "It's only a cat," I said rather more shortly than I had intended. "We can hardly have a full requiem mass, you know." He looked so hurt that I was immediately ashamed of giving way to ugly resentment. Look, Charles, they breed him over here now. We can always get another one if you really want. He turned away in silence, revolted no doubt by my clumsy and sensitive suggestion, and began to finger the jewels in the collar with the sort of reverence that is only reserved for a rosary. These are real diamonds, aren't they, Dad? I believe so, I said stiffly. There must be enough to make a pendant necklace, he continued thoughtfully. May I draw some money from my account and have them made up for Mother? I swallowed hard as I hammered the lid on the box with grim finality and rather unnecessary vigor. It's your money, Charles, I said quietly. You don't need to ask my permission to use it. We went down to breakfast side by side, having agreed not to break the news to Christine until the following day, when the animal would be safely buried and she could not ask to see it. She was already seated at the table waiting for us on the special day. Beside her plate was the single red rose that I always placed there on the anniversary of Charles' birth. I thought it a romantic touch, a single red rose, a symbol of my unchanging love, but she wept so poignantly the first time I presented her with one that I had considered abandoning the idea then. If it upsets you, no, she said hastily. It doesn't upset me at all. It was a lovely thought, Raoul. It's just reminded me of a sad legend that I once heard. Oh, I see. One of your father's old tales, I suppose? She looked down at the rose. That's right, she said softly, pressing the bloom lightly against her cheek. One of Father's stories. Perhaps one day I'll tell it to you. I hadn't pressed her to tell, and assumed the incident had slipped from her mind. At any rate, she never wept again, and I gave her a red rose, and the practice had slowly become a ritual between us over the years. I knew that she kept the petals long after flower had faded and died. Now she looked up, and smile that had been hovering on her lips was extinguished at the sight of Charles. My dear, your eyes. He bent down to kiss her cheek with admirable nonchalance. It's nothing, he said carelessly. Too much riding the wind yesterday, that's all. I say, you don't mind it if I have kippers, do you, Mother? It's my last day at home, and it is my birthday. Oh, Charles, she exclaimed with indulgent, half-hearted protest. What horribly British taste that school is breeding in you. She sat down again at the table, amused, adoring, and skillfully distracted from a line of questioning that might have proved awkward, watching him pick the tiny bones from the objectionable fish without the faintest suspicion that anything was wrong. It must have nearly choked him to swallow that kipper for her sake, but he never hesitated. He ate like a starving schoolboy who has nothing but birthday presents on his mind. Pouring myself a cup of coffee, I watched him with quiet respect, and it crossed my mind, not for the first time, that his father would have been proud of him. Charles was away at school when Christine died, 4 years later. She had been ill for a long time with a gradual wasting sickness that was eventually diagnosed as cancer, but the end came with an unexpected suddenness that found us quite unprepared. Stunned and numbed with shock, I unlocked a drawer in the table at the side of her bed and removed the contents, which she had made me promise to bury with her. The drawer was full of pressed rose petals. It seemed to me that for every red bloom that I had ever given her, she herself must have added a white, and the crisp, dry petals were mingled irretrievably together, giving off a faint, lingering perfume as they crumbled to powder in my head. Beneath the petals lay the necklace of diamonds which had once been a cat's collar, its gold clasp nestling inside a wedding ring. Lifting the ring out and examining it, I found it to be a simple gold band that looked as new and unworn as it must have done the day it was purchased in France all those years ago. It was very small, the same size as the ring I had first bought her, which had to be cut from her hand as her fingers swelled during pregnancy. At the bottom of the drawer was a small piece of paper, evidently cut from the score of an opera, which I finally recognized as Aida. My heart foreseeing your condemnation, into this tomb I made my way by stealth, and here, far from every human gaze, in your arms, I wished to die. With the scrap of paper in my hand, I went slowly down to the library and took out Charles' well-thumbed copy of Faust. I was reasonably certain of the quotation for which I searched, but wanted to be quite sure there was no mistake in the wording. When I found it, I copied it neatly down onto a slip of paper and looked at it for a moment. Holy angel, in heaven blessed, my spirit longs with thee to rest. Returning to the drawing room where the open coffin lay in the single room of a single candelabrum, I placed the wedding ring on her little finger, fastened the necklace around her pale shriveled throat, and tucked the two quotations into the dazzling satin folds of the lining. And then I scattered the remains of the rose petals all around her. When it was done, I had a strange feeling of peace, as though I had completed the final act of some lifelong quest. I had held her in trust for 17 years until death chose to reunite her with the one to whom she truly belonged. It was an aching sadness which I knew would never leave me, and yet there was also a sense of release, a sudden lifting of guilt. I myself placed the lid upon the coffin, that no undertaker might be tempted by the fortune and stones which we laid to rest with her. It rained heavily during the committal, as it always seems to do on such occasions in England. The fresh white roses were bruised and splashed with mud as the coffin was lowered into the gaping maw in the ground. Beneath the black umbrella, Charles held my arm in fiercely protective grip, as though he feared I might do something very stupid in my grief. His face was white and tragic, but the eyes that rested on mine were full of compassionate understanding. I remember that when the service was over, he led me very carefully back to our carriage, just as though I were a blind and crippled man. The final curtains had been taken. Lights had been lit throughout the auditorium, and people are shuffling from their seats, stretching surreptitiously in their stiff dress suits and high-necked evening gowns. The unseemly rush of cloaks and carriages is about to begin, but I, who have nowhere to hurry to now, continue to sit unmoving in the very armchair where Erik must once have sat to look at Christine. Charles leans over and lays his hand on mine. He does not speak, for he knows instinctively that there are times when it is better to say nothing, as sympathy can be more easily expressed in touch than in meaningless words. He waits instead, with a quiet patience quite alien to his age, while I collect myself in slow degrees and prepare to leave Box 5 for the last time. I shall not come here again. The memories are too deeply painful, and yet I do not regret this time of reflection, this cauterizing of an old, unhealing wound. The crowds on the Grand Escalier have begun to disperse, and I can see Charles looking around with undisguised admiration. "What a magnificent building," he says with awe, as we step out into the cool evening air. "I wonder if the men who built it are still alive to marvel at their great achievement." "Erik has been dead for 17 years, I hear myself murmur softly. "Erik? Was he a friend of yours, Dad?" The flicker of eager interest in his voice makes the corners of my lips lift in a sad, ironic smile. "Your mother knew him better than I." "Was he an architect?" "Architect, musician, magician, composer. A genius in very many fields. So I was once told." The interest becomes a faintly puzzled frown. "I wonder why Mother never spoke of him. It's a pity he died, isn't it? I'd like to have known him." "Yes." Our cab draws slowly out into the crowded street, and glancing out, I'm afforded a receding view of the opera's imposing Baroque facade. "Yes, my dear boy. I rather think that you would." We are silent for a time, and after that he considers to be a decent interval, Charles begins on the subject I've been half expecting. The dog we knocked down earlier is an ownerless stray. Can't we take it back to England with us and give it a home? I make some feeble protest about the new importation regulations, 6 months detention and isolation at the place provided by the owner. But Charles is wearing his mulish look, and I know there's no point in arguing. In his eyes, I too am really another lost dog now, something to be cared for and coaxed back to happiness. So how can I fault for such an open heart? The opera house dwindles in the distance until it seems no bigger than a doll's house in the shadows, a diminutive lost kingdom shrouded by the thick Parisian mist. 17 years. Erik, too long for bitterness, too long for hate. Your genius was not wiped from this earth without trace, and I have brought him here tonight like a young pilgrim to a shrine in final payment for a long outstanding debt. I, who shared so unwillingly in your tragedy, now find myself, by some ironic twist of fate, left alone to glory in your triumph. This brilliant, loving boy who calls me father in his innocence has taught me so many things I might never have grasped out of love. I see the world through his eyes now. I glimpse my appointed place in the grand order of things. Like a wary sparrow, I can look with fond pride on the giant I have raised as my own. My feathers have grown sparse and shabby in a difficult quest, but I am warned and comforted by his presence now. I dread the day when I must lose him to the fame and glory that unquestionably await. His sons will continue the proud Chadney line, and I will take my secret with me to the grave without resentment, almost without regret. The cuckoo, you see. The cuckoo is a beautiful bird. That is the end, and this is the author's note. It would not be possible to end this book without gracefully acknowledging the various sources which were of inspiration to me during its writing, from the wonderful musical of Andrew Lloyd Webber right back to the original silent film. In the course of my research, I discovered many different phantoms: Lon Chaney, Claude Rains, and Michael Crawford, all adding their own interpretations to a character who has intrigued audiences for much of this century. Perhaps the most faithful representation of Lou's original book is the 1967 full-length cartoon. Unexpectedly moving in its final scenes, this adaptation, like the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, allows the Phantom that crucial moment of sacrifice and redemption which other versions have consistently denied him. When I came to read the LaRue novel, hoping to learn much more about this extraordinary character, I found that the book opened more questions for me than it actually answered. Why, for instance, did Raoul remain so jealous and uncertain of Christine's affection, even after he knew that the truth about Erik's hideous disfigurement? Why did Christine insist on returning to Erik, for days at a time, when Raoul was so desperately eager to take her away from danger? Pity and fear hardly seem adequate explanations for her behavior. Was it possible that Raoul was nearer to the truth than he suspected in his angry assertion that Christine's terror of the Phantom was love of the most exquisite kind, the kind which people do not admit, even to themselves? One of the most interesting characters I came across in LaRue was the mysterious Persian, for he, too, posed a number of interesting questions. Why did he risk his own neck to save the life of a man he knew to be a shameless murderer? Again, LaRue's explanation, that Erik had shown him some slight services and procured him many a hearty laugh, hardly seems an adequate explanation for putting one's own life at risk. The pity and tolerance of the Persian seemed to me to hint at a deep and abiding friendship, a friendship that LaRue, constrained by the genre of his mystery/thriller, did not have the opportunity to explore. The little black book began to live on my bedside table, and I returned again and again to those passages which intrigued and puzzled me. Increasingly, I found my attention drawn to the final 3 pages, to the brief historical outline, in which LaRue accounts for the Phantom's early existence. The main bulk of his novel, intended all screen and stage versions, had dealt only with the last 6 months or so in the life of a man who must have been about 50. I began to feel that the tale we had come to know as the Phantom of the Opera was perhaps only the magnificent tip of the iceberg, and that somewhere beneath a huge human story lay waiting to be told. The story of a man who was driven to many terrible vices and yet still retained, in LaRue's own words, a heart that could have held the empire of the world. The eventful and exciting past at which LaRue had hinted must surely have been filled with a number of significant relationships, perhaps even an earlier love affair. This was the story I wanted to read, and eventually I began to understand that it was also the story I wanted to write. I embarked on the project with many deep reservations. No author can tamper with a well-known classic tale, and particularly one which has been so successful in different mediums, without an uneasy feeling of presumption. And I was well aware that to set the Phantom in the historical background which LaRue had envisaged for him would require research on a very wide scale, a knowledge of music, voice training, ventriloquism, magic, gypsy lore, architecture, and stonemasonry, not to mention the historical and cultural background of 4 different countries. 18 months later, the book was finished. It had taken me to Rome and America in the quest for material, but after the early days of initial frustration, the research resolved itself in a number of remarkable lucky finds. Monroe Butler Johnson's A Trip Up the Volga to the Fair of Nizhny Novgorod provided valuable details for Erik's life in Russia. Curzon's Persia and the Persian Question, and Lady Shell's eyewitness account of Persian court life in the mid-19th century enabled me to slide Erik into the affairs of the existing Shah and his Grand Vizier, Mirza Taqi Khan. Christopher Meade's thesis on Charles Garnier and the building of the Paris Opera was eventually located in America, the only definitive English language work which presently exists on the architect and his remarkable building. The Phantom, who has emerged in the course of this book, owes something to all the many different interpretations of the character that must have been made during the last few decades, and a vast amount, of course, to his original creator. But inevitably, he has been altered and modeled to fit the contours of my own imagination. There is a curious, timeless fascination to this legendary character, and I have no doubt that the process of reinterpretation will continue over the decades to come. Susan K., November 1989. And I do believe that's the end of the book. That's all I have. So thank you so much for hanging on to me with me reading this book over the years. I know it's been hard for me to get them out, but a lot has happened in my own life while I've been reading this book and posting videos. I don't know if I'll do something like this again. I have plans to read Phantom of the Manhattan, which, as you know, for many Phantom fans, that's the basis of Love Never Dies. And it's awful. And I'm going to read it. I think that's my next project. I'm going to read it, but it's not going to be serious like this one. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm sorry. I've been through 3 mics during the course of this reading. First was one that I had from a while ago, and then it broke. Then I was using a mic attached to my headphones, and now finally this new mic, which I just got to finish this video, which has hopefully clearer audio. I apologize for any other disturbances you would hear in the background, one of which that has been persistent is my cat, who, whenever I start talking, she feels the need to get my attention. So I apologize if you've heard any of that. Again, this was done for fun. This is in no way professional. I'm not seeking a profit off of this. This is just for people who don't have the book. I also linked the book in the description if you would like to buy it. It's a good read. I personally prefer if you read the book on your own because I massacre a lot of words. So that's always a plus. Don't forget to check back to this channel. I don't know if I'm going to do the Phantom of Manhattan on this channel or my newer channel, which is going to have more content that is stuff that is going to be more relevant and things that I could actually make a little profit off of. So don't forget to look up the Fire Dragon's Forge on that one. Thank you again so much, guys, for giving me all your continued support, being patient with me. I really appreciate it. So yeah, that was Phantom by Susan K.